Hey bass anglers, today we're going to unveil a little information about the full moon and how it affects bass fishing. It can definitely give you an advantage if you know what's going on during and after these full moon periods, or how to approach your bass fishing techniques to give you a little more success. So it's the beginning of June here in north central Wisconsin, and we had our first bass tournament. So it's commonly known that the moon phases affect fishing. And there's theories about how it affects fishing, but here's from my observation what I've seen from my time on the water of what it does and how to be successful and maybe strategic about what you're doing. So look for the full moons on your calendar, and in this particular example we're throwing up, we've got a new moon on June 6th, and we're going to have a full moon again, the strawberry moon, on June 21st. And those are two key time periods. And so our tournament was on June 2nd. And on this chart, you'll see that the magic period that I'm going to talk about is 3 days before and during and 3 days after that full moon period. You have to be focused on shallow fishing. And I mean shallow fishing. The fish are feeding, and it isn't as much about the fish feeding bite in my experience, although that's part of it, but it's because of how the moon affects other species. And in particular here, we're going to talk about minnows and crayfish and their spawning and activity in the shallows during these periods of time around the full moon. There's more activity. Let's just call it that. We don't need to pin down exactly if they're spawning or if they're, if they're molting or whatever they're doing. There is more bait activity 3 days before and 3 days after the full moon and during these little full moon windows. And consequently, the bass fishing is shallow. I'll give you the advice to start shallow and stay shallow during these periods. And try to target your presentations from the absolute shoreline into 3 feet of water. We caught all of our fish super shallow. We were just ahead of this window for our recent bass fishing tournament. It happened to be our first one. Alex and I were a little out of practice, so the day didn't go super well, though we were going to concentrate shallow and we were going to use crayfish and baitfish imitators. We had one of our catches hork up a huge crayfish and a huge baitfish. Like, we were surprised at how big the baitfish was that this 14-inch bass had spit up on us. I mean, we lost, they were small fish to begin with, but we lost a significant amount of weight from the crayfish and the baitfish that it puked up. But they were feeding, and they were feeding heavily, and they were feeding super shallow. I mean, we heard several times, and in my experience at these windows, whether it's in June or whether it's in July, when we get around these windows, I hear bass fishing predation going on at the shoreline, at the literal shoreline. And we were on a river system here, so there was, maybe 2-3 feet of water. It was very tannic and dark water too, so we didn't see it with our eyes, but we heard the splashes and the crayfish feeding activity of the smallmouth bass, like going up and almost getting out of the water right on the shoreline, grabbing crayfish and baitfish that were super shallow. We've heard that phenomenon on several lakes up here, and if you're in an inland lake that's got crayfish and baitfish, these bass and smallmouth or largemouth bass, they will feed really shallow. And so that's a key to it. Stay shallow. And so how do you approach this shallow fishing? In your pre-fishing, you're looking for fish activity, but you're also looking for prime areas for crayfish activity. Maybe at presence of crayfish, you're looking for, if you're using your side imaging, look for gravel, look for rock bars that extend from that 2-3 feet right up to shore. So you're looking for shallow gravel, rock, sand. You're looking for areas where you're going to find crayfish, and sometimes just covering water, not necessarily fishing, but looking to find those prime feeding areas, because they're not all going to be prime. A lily pad area isn't going to be a prime crayfish feeding area, or mucky areas, so you can eliminate a lot of water by looking for hard shorelines, look for points, look for pockets that, the smallmouth can get up to. So points, pockets, hard shorelines, shallow, where there's crayfish activity. that's going to put you in the ballpark in these little feeding time periods. And it's going to be, the other day there was the successful teams that won the tournament. The difference in this lake between winning and finishing 15th is 2-3 pounds. So getting those females when they're feeding was important. We didn't do that. We ended up with a limit of males and ended up in the middle of the pack. But there were teams that didn't catch any because they weren't pinned on this shallow feeding activity. And then you weren't going to catch fish to get your limit at all. So the baits of choice, again, were shallow, baits that you can successfully fish shallow, right? And so orange Ned rigs, something to, greens and oranges. Here's a weedless Ned head. Pair that up with the Z-Man TRD Craws. That's the deadly bait this time of year. Ned rigs work. Anything that's going to imitate a crayfish. Small Get Bit Baits tube that's got some orange and browns and greens in it is also a successful bait that we caught several fish on. Another lure that can be used very successfully shallow to imitate a crayfish scurrying and moving really quickly in super skinny water is a Rogue floating jerkbait, the one that's got the orange on the bottom of it. I've got a separate video on the weighting on this, so it floats, and then when you pull it under, I've got it neutrally buoyant and can keep it in really skinny water. I've got a separate video I'll put at the end, check that out. But when the bite is hot and there's many fish in an area feeding, this can get them quick because this pins them up. They slash at this. They're going to get hooked up if you've got the right hooks on it. But a great bait. We caught several of our wave fish on this bait here. And then also they were feeding on bait fish. So, a swim bait, and I've got a custom one here from Flag Baits, but if any kind of a minnow swim bait, swim jig, really shallow, imitating either a bait fish or a crayfish is going to be effective. So 3 days before, 3 days after, that's a key. Then the other key is paying attention to the majors and the minors. The big fish will bite 1 to 2 hours after a major, and then they'll bite for an hour after the minor. So I'll repeat that because that's important. If you're looking for that kicker fish, make sure to check your lunar table and find out when the majors and minors are. 1 to 2 hours after a major, and then 1 hour after a minor. I would be in big fish spots looking for my kicker fish. So, and you mix that in with the shallow of the 3 days before, 3 days after. Like I said, there's a great depth to fish 3 days before and 3 days after a full moon, and that's in the shoreline to 3 feet. In rocky, gravelly, sandy areas where fish are going to be feeding shallow, you will hear fish. If you're in those areas, you will hear fish exploding right on the shoreline, grabbing crayfish that are virtually almost out of the water. So, hope you found this tip helpful. I know you heard a lot about the lunar effect, and we don't need to necessarily get into the actual science of the feeding and spawning habits of the bait and the bass, but let's know this: if there's a full moon, there's going to be a crayfish bite 3 days before, 3 days after, and it's going to occur very shallow in your system. So put that to use. I'd love to hear how you do. Please send me a message and let me know if you have that same experience with hearing fish in those areas blow up in virtually no feet of water. And can you be successful employing a fishing technique that keeps you in that zone in those periods? And let's see if you can't put a big bag in the boat. Hope you found that tip helpful. Please like and subscribe, and we'll talk to you next time on the water.